Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel and welcome to a new month. I hope you all have a wonderful February ahead of you. As it is the start of the month, today I'm going to be sharing some reading recommendations for February with you all. As you know, I love to do a bit of seasonal reading and I love to recommend books that I think would make good reads for every month of the year. So I've got a big stack to share with you today. I have some books that start in February. I have some new releases I'm really excited about this month, some light romances that are perfect Valentine's Day reads, and I'm also going to share some non-fiction and children's book recommendations with you. I've got a lot of books to recommend, so what I hope you'll do with this list is just be inspired by a few titles that you might want to add to your February to be read pile. But yes, I've got a lot to share, so let's get going. To start, of course, I want to share the Comfort Book Club pick for this month. I co-host the Comfort Book Club on YouTube with my mum Donna. On the last Friday of every month, we chat about a favourite comfort book of ours and we encourage anyone who wants to read along with us. So this month we're reading Miss Bunkle's book by D.E. Stevenson. I love D.E. Stevenson's books and this one is a real favourite. This is in the beautiful Persephone Books Classic Edition that just came out in the autumn, but it's also available in their grey regular edition. I enjoy this book because it's a real cosy read. It's about a woman probably in her 30s who is single and she lives in an English village. The recession is on and she's in need of some money. So she decides to write a book and she thinks that she'll write what she knows, which is the village life and the people all around her. To her great surprise, her book becomes a huge hit and bestseller. And she has mistakenly thought that no one will actually recognise themselves in her book. But in fact, her neighbours do. And they all try to find out who it is who's written this awful book about them. And much hilarity ensues. There's a little bit of light romance in this too. And I just think this book is such a fun, comforting read for February. So I hope you enjoy it too if you're reading along with us. I'll put more information about the Comfort Book Club in the description box down below. And then I wanted to share a few books that are coming out this month that I'm excited about. So Hear No Evil by Sarah Smith is a new book that's just about to come out, and it actually starts in February, making it an even better read for February. This sounds like such an interesting historical fiction book. It's set in Glasgow in Scotland in the early 1800s, and it's based on a real life case, a real life trial of a woman who is deaf. And this woman is witnessed seemingly throwing a child into a river. But no one can actually find out what the truth of this story is. And a man is brought in who I think is head of the Deaf and Dumb Institution or something like that at the time. And he manages to communicate in some way with this woman, and as he finds out more about her story, he turns into a sort of amateur investigator and tries to make sure that justice is done and that she is able to tell her story. So I'm very intrigued by this. I'm always keen on books that are set in Scotland, and I'm really excited about this Glasgow setting. I've been to Glasgow once and I'm looking forward to reading a book that's set in Glasgow in the 1800s and based on a real life case. I always find interesting too. So I'm excited about that. Then this book is coming out in February as well, Love Marriage by Monica Ali, and I have the proof edition of the book and I'm really looking forward to reading it. It says, Yasmin Gorami has a lot to be grateful for: a loving family, a fledgling career in medicine, and a charming, handsome fiancé, fellow Dr. Joe Sangster. But as the wedding day draws closer and Yasmin's parents get to know Joe's firebrand feminist mother, both families must confront the unraveling of long-held secrets, lies, and betrayals. And Yasmin, through the course of this book, has to decide for herself what a love marriage really means. This is meant to be really fun, and I love that it's a book all about relationships and the build up to a marriage and questioning your own values and expectations of life and love and marriage. And I think this will be a brilliant read for Valentine's. So I'm really looking forward to getting to this one myself. Then this book just came out recently, and I just saw that Reese Witherspoon has picked it for her book club, Reese's book club, for the February read of that book club. So I'm really hoping I'll be able to read along this month. It sounds so good. It's called The Christie Affair by Nina de Graymont. And as you know, I'm a big fan of Agatha Christie, and this book looks at the real life circumstance when Agatha Christie went missing for 11 days and then I think turned up in Harrogate, which isn't too far from where I live. And this book is written from the perspective of the woman who Agatha Christie's husband was having an affair with. So she was his mistress. And I'm really intrigued by this love triangle. I think that this sort of fictional interpretation of why Agatha Christie went missing, what happened, what was the relationship like between Agatha Christie and her husband's mistress, I think all of that will be explored in this book, and I'm really keen to read it. I've heard some good things about it already, so I'm excited for this. Then, of course, in the month of romance, I can't not mention my favourite author, Jane Austen, and I bought this beautiful edition of Sense and Sensibility as a little Valentine treat, early Valentine treat for myself. I love these editions. They're the Marjolaine Bastine editions, and they're just beautifully illustrated inside, and they have little letters tucked in to the pages and postcards like this, which I think is so gorgeous. But they're also just really beautifully illustrated books with little floral illustrations scattered throughout. I'll show you the illustration here. I think that's just stunning. And I recently listened for about the millionth time to Sense and Sensibility again. I think this is such a great choice for February. I think Marianne's Sensibility is the perfect read for such a romantic month. But I always love the story of these two sisters, and it was so wonderful to get such a beautiful new edition of the book. Pride and Prejudice is, of course, also always my favourite Jane Austen to read when I'm really in a romantic mood, and I'm sure I'll be listening to that on Audible sometime this month as well, because I almost always have a Jane Austen on the go. But Sense and Sensibility was my most recent listen, and I'm so thrilled to get this beautiful edition. Then I do have some suggestions for other fans of Jane Austen. There's one author who is quite often referenced as a good one to try if you are a big Jane Austen fan, and that's Emily Eden. This is a edition of her work that combines her two novels, The Semi-Attached Couple and The Semi-Detached House. I've never actually seen these books available separately. I've just always seen this Virago edition with them both together. And the one I especially like and recommend is The Semi-Attached Couple. This was written by Emily Eden in the 1830s, and it was actually published in, I think, 1860, but it was written 30 years prior to that. And there's a lot of a sort of similar tone to Jane Austen, and Emily Eden specifically references Jane Austen in this novel too. One of the characters talks about how much she likes Elizabeth Bennet, and I think one of them is reading Pride and Prejudice, so it's a huge fan of Pride and Prejudice. So I really liked that reference to Jane Austen in this book. But you can tell Emily Eden was inspired by Austen by the tone of her writing, especially in The Semi-Attached Couple. I think that's the one that is the strongest of the two books and is a lot more comparable to Jane Austen. Obviously, it isn't Jane Austen. It isn't as good as Jane Austen, but Emily Eden still writes with this sort of wry sense of humour that fans of Austen will definitely appreciate. Her themes are similar to Austen. She's interested in love and matrimony and whether or not those two always go together. But unlike Austen, she starts off her novel when a marriage is just about to take place, and then you see past that marriage and the beginning of a life of a newlywed couple. And at first they really misunderstand each other, even though really they both love each other. But a lot of misunderstandings occur until by the end they're reconciled. But what I adore about The Semi-Attached Couple is actually all of the secondary characters in the novel. There are some real sort of Jane Austen types there. Characters love to grumble about everything and find fault with everyone and everything, and characters who fancy, there's one character in particular, Lady Portmore, who fancies that every man is in love with her, even though he definitely is not. And just some very amusing, entertaining characters that are very Jane Austen-like. The Semi-Detached House is quite a different tone. It was written, I think, later than The Semi-Attached Couple, and it is still quite a light, pleasant read. However, I mean, both books are obviously of their time. They both contain some sentiments and expressions that are offensive now, but The Semi-Detached House, I think, has aged especially badly. There are a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes in that novel, and like I said, the one I really want to recommend is The Semi-Attached Couple. If you're a fan of Jane Austen, then give it a go. Now, of course, a lot of fans of Jane Austen already know about George Eliot. She was a writer in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and she wrote a lot of Regency-inspired romances. And I always enjoy picking up one of her books as a light read. I like the sort of light romance style of them. And one I would like to reread again is the Nun Such. I haven't read this one for ages, and it's, I think, predominantly set around Harrogate. So in the part of Yorkshire that I'm living in, and I would like to return to the book for that reason. So I'm hoping I'll get a chance to read this again myself this month. I also have to say, if you're a Jane Austen fan, then do watch the 2020 film of Emma, which is now available on Netflix. It's such a feast for the eyes, that book. It's absolutely gorgeous to watch. My mum and I just watched it again, and we really enjoyed seeing it again. But I think it's a perfect sort of Valentine watch, because it's just all of the clothes and the interiors are shot in the most beautiful pastel colours, and it really is a feast for the eyes. So if you haven't seen it yet, then I definitely recommend giving it a watch. I would like to read this book myself this month. It's A Single Thread of Moonlight by Laura Wood. I've spoken about Laura Wood quite a bit on this channel before because I've read all of her other previous books. This one just came out in the autumn and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But she again is a great author. If you're a fan of books like George Eliot or that sort of light romance, then her books are really a good one to pick up. she is a YA author, so the language is definitely more simplistic and some of the plots are a bit fanciful, but I still do enjoy these as a sort of cozy read. I think this one is set in Victorian times and it's about a young woman who is from quite an upper class background, but for some reason she sort of runs away from home and she ends up becoming a dressmaker. But then she meets a man and love is in the air. It's meant to be a sort of Cinderella type story, and I think I also heard that it was a little bit reminiscent of Pride and Prejudice. So I'm not sure if that's true, but I think that I did read something along those lines. So I'm definitely eager to try it and I'm looking forward to picking this up. Should be a nice quick read, hopefully. Then if you watched my video on what I got for Christmas, you'll remember that I was so thrilled my mum gave me this book, Sally Ann by Susan Scarlett, which was a pen name of Noel Streatfeild. I'm a huge Streatfeild fan. I love Ballet Shoes. It's one of my all-time favourite books. But also Noel Streatfeild wrote a few books under the pen name of Susan Scarlett, and they're all sort of light romances that were written in the 1930s, 1940s, that kind of time. And this was the last one that's been republished by Grey Ladies that I didn't have. So I'm so thrilled to have got it and I'd really like to read it this month. It sounds like quite a fun one. It's about a young woman who has to step in to help at a wedding and do the bride's makeup for her. And suddenly one of the bridesmaids of the bride is taken ill, and only this young woman is slim enough to fit her bridesmaid dress. So even though they don't know each other, Sally Ann, as she becomes called, steps in as bridesmaid to this stranger, and I think all sorts of love entanglements ensue after that. So I'm definitely intrigued by the plot, and with the wedding theme, it sounds like it will be quite an appropriate read for February around Valentine's. So I'm looking forward to getting to that. Then a very favourite book of mine from my childhood is Betsy's Wedding by Hart Lovelace. I would really like to reread this month. I love the Betsy Tacy books by Hart Lovelace. They were written in the 1940s, but they record Hart Lovelace's own childhood, living as a young woman in the early 1900s, growing up in the Midwest. There's a whole series that follows Betsy Ray, the heroine, who was very much based on Hart Lovelace herself. She's a young woman who has two best friends, Tacy and Tib, and she is an aspiring writer. And you follow her from a very young girl all the way up through her high school years and then into marriage. And this is the last book in the series that sees Betsy wedded to the love of her life, and it follows her sort of first year of matrimony after that. It's one of my absolute favourites of the series. I adore this one, and yes, I'm really in the mood to reread this, so I hope I manage to get to it this month. Then of course, some short stories all about love. It's definitely appropriate for February. This is the, I think it's the Everyman. Yes, it's the Everyman Pocket Classics series of short stories. And this is a collection of stories all about love. Not love that always goes well. And sometimes these stories are about jealousy, as well as romantic love. Some of them are pleasant stories, some are not so pleasant, but they represent writers from all around the world, and I've had this collection for quite a few years now and I always enjoy dipping into it. So I'll maybe put this on my bedside table this month so I can read some of these short stories again. Then a historical fiction book I would like to get to this month is In Love with George Eliot, a novel by Cathy O'Shaughnessy. I hope I've said that right, but apologies if not. And this partly explores the relationship that George Eliot had with a married man and her being completely outcast from society. It also follows a present day storyline as well. It says, Marian Evans is a scandalous figure living in sin with a married man, George Henry Lewis. She has shocked polite society, and women rarely deign to visit her. In secret, though, she has begun writing fiction under the pseudonym George Eliot. As Adam Bede's fame grows, curiosity rises as to the identity of its mysterious writer. Gradually, it becomes apparent that the moral genius Eliot is none other than the disgraced woman living with Lewis. And it says, meanwhile, in another rudderless century, two women compete to arrive at an interpretation of Eliot as writer and woman. I'm really intrigued by this. I think it sounds really good, and it's been sitting on my bookcase for ages, so I'm hoping to get to it this month. And then I thought a good non-fiction to read in parallel to that, excuse the pun, is Parallel Lives by Phyllis Rose. And this book looks at 5 Victorian marriages, and it does actually look at George Eliot's partnership with George Henry Lewis. So I think it would be really interesting to read this maybe alongside In Love with George Eliot. It also looks at Dickens's disastrous marriage and 3 other marriages or partnerships in the Victorian era. So I definitely recommend this as maybe a non-fiction choice for February. And another non-fiction choice that I thought I would recommend is Vita and Virginia, The Lives and Love of Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West by Sarah Gristwood. This is a really beautiful book. Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West had a passionate affair in the 1920s, but they also had a very strong bond and friendship that went on for many years of their lives. And this book explores that bond, and it really is beautifully illustrated. There are lots of photographs, sort of quite little known photographs, as well as pictures of Sissinghurst, for instance. Here, that's a really lovely shot of Sissinghurst, and it's just really beautifully illustrated and really interesting. So another book that would be nice to pick up this month. And then another non-fiction choice that I think would make a great gift for your girlfriend for Galentine's as opposed to Valentine's is this book, How to Be a Heroine by Samantha Ellis, which really reminds you to be the heroine of your own life. And it's a memoir of Samantha Ellis, who is a writer and a playwright in her own right, but this is a memoir of hers that explores the heroines from literature that shaped her own life. And I love her analysis of many heroines from classic works of literature. She looks at Lucy Honeychurch, for instance, and Elizabeth Bennet. She looks at Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre and many classic books, but I love the interpretation that she brings to them, and also the story of her own life that runs alongside looking at these heroines. So like I said, I think this would be a great Galentine's gift. And then another book that I think would be a great Galentine's present, this is a fiction choice, and that's Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. This is all about the life of a young black woman living in London and her navigating all sorts of relationships. But the most important relationship that she navigates in the course of this book is the relationship that she has with herself. But this as well as being about romantic entanglements, it really is also about female friendship. And I think it's just a funny, entertaining read that is a perfect book to sort of pick up with, you know, maybe a glass of wine and some chocolates and enjoy just immersing yourself in this story. I think it would make, again, a perfect gift for a girlfriend to celebrate Galentine's this month. And then one other fiction book I would like to get to, because it starts in February, is this book, The Last Garden in England by Julia Kelly. I just love that cover. I think it's stunning. And this book is all about a fictional garden in Britain and the stories of women who are in some way connected to the garden. It follows 3 different timelines. The first timeline is set, I think it's set around 1910, sort of pre-World War One. Then there's a timeline that's set all during World War II, and then there's a more modern day timeline about a woman who goes back to this garden and sort of wants to bring it to the level of its former grandeur. So it follows the lives of different women from different times, but how they're all connected by this particular garden and landscape in Britain. So I'm really intrigued by that premise. I think it sounds like the sort of book I would really enjoy. So yes, I'm really hoping to get to this. And as it starts in February, it seems like the perfect month to pick it up. Then talking about gardens in literature, of course I have to mention The Secret Garden. This book begins at a time that's clearly, you know, well after Christmas, but before spring has really started, when Mary sees the garden just beginning to show the faintest signs of life. So I think that February, just when snowdrops are starting to come out, is the sort of perfect time to pick up this book, and it will really help you to look forward to spring and to notice all the small signs of life in the landscape around you, those little signs of spring coming along. So The Secret Garden is such a classic children's book. I love that it's a love letter not only to gardening but also to Yorkshire, and I think it would be a great one to read this month. And then finally, one last recommendation is another classic children's book, and that's Little White Horse by Elizabeth Goudge. This book also starts actually with a rather bad-tempered young woman going to a strange house in the countryside, and there she discovers all sorts of mysteries that she wants to solve. It starts in February, so if you've never read The Little White Horse or you want to reread it, then this month is definitely a great time to pick it up again. I would really like to try and reread it this month. Elizabeth Goudge is so good at blending fantasy into her children's fiction, and there is always that element of the magical that comes into her writing for children that makes her books really special. But this is her most famous book for children, and it was such a favourite of mine. When I read it as a child, I adored it, and I would really like to return to it myself this month. But anyway, those are all of my recommendations for February reads. Let me know if you'd like to pick up any of these books this month, or let me know any other books that you think would be great to read in February. I'd love to know. But thank you so much for watching. Do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and you can subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face that pops up over here. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend ahead of you, and I'll see you again next week. Goodbye.